The morning of June 14th, 2008, dawned crisp and clear in Pine Ridge, Colorado, with the kind of mountain air that made you believe anything was possible. Ellie Monroe pulled her faded denim jacket tighter as she stepped out of her family's modest ranch house, her worn Converse sneakers crunching on the gravel driveway. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent her whole life in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Until they didn't. "Don't forget your lunch," her mother, Janet, called from the kitchen window, holding up a brown paper bag. Janet Monroe worked double shifts at the county hospital, her nurse's uniform already crisp and ready for another long day. The worry lines around her eyes had deepened since her husband Tom lost his job at the lumber mill 3 months earlier. "Thanks, Mom." Ellie jogged back to grab the bag, pressing a quick kiss to her mother's cheek. "I'll be home by 11. Jenny's picking me up after my shift." The Sunrise Diner sat at the junction of Highway 285 and Old Mill Road, a chrome and vinyl relic from the 1950s that served as Pine Ridge's unofficial town square. Truckers, locals, and the occasional tourist heading to the nearby ski resorts all filtered through its doors, making it the perfect summer job for a teenager saving for college. Ellie had been working there for 6 weeks, and while the pay wasn't much, she enjoyed the steady rhythm of coffee pours and order calls. The diner's owner, Frank Castellano, was a bear of a man with salt and pepper hair and hands permanently stained with coffee grounds. He'd moved to Pine Ridge from New Jersey 15 years earlier, seeking the quiet life after his wife passed. "Morning, sunshine," he greeted Ellie as she tied her apron around her waist. "You ready for another day in paradise?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Ellie laughed, checking the coffee machines. The familiar sounds of the diner starting up, the hiss of the grill, the clatter of dishes, the bell above the door, had become comforting background music to her summer routine. The morning rush began. At 6:30 sharp, construction workers heading to the new subdivision project ordered coffee and eggs over easy. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, picked up her usual blueberry muffin and chamomile tea. Sheriff Roy Hartman stopped by for his black coffee and wheat toast, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd kept the peace in Pine Ridge for 23 years. "How's your dad doing, Ellie?" Sheriff Hartman asked, sliding exact change across the counter. His weathered face showed genuine concern. Pine Ridge was small enough that everyone's troubles were community troubles. "He's hanging in there," Ellie replied, refilling his cup. "Got a job interview next week at the hardware store in Alamosa. Fingers crossed." Around 10:30, the breakfast crowd thinned out, leaving just a few regulars nursing their coffee and reading day-old newspapers. Ellie wiped down tables and refilled sugar dispensers, her movements efficient from weeks of practice. The June sun streamed through the diner's large windows, promising another hot afternoon. That's when Marcus Webb walked in. Marcus was new to Pine Ridge, had been for about a month anyway, which in small-town terms meant he was still a stranger. He'd rented the small apartment above Kowalski's hardware store and claimed to be a freelance journalist researching a story about dying mountain towns. He was somewhere in his 30s, with the kind of lean build that came from too much coffee and not enough regular meals. His dark hair was perpetually messy, and he carried an old leather satchel that looked like it had seen half the world. "The usual?" Ellie asked as he settled into his preferred booth by the window. "Coffee, black, and whatever pie Frank's got today," Marcus said, pulling out a small digital recorder and setting it on the table. "Mind if I record while I eat? I'm working on some atmospheric stuff. You know, the sounds of small-town America." Ellie shrugged. "As long as Frank doesn't mind." She'd grown used to Marcus's quirks over the past few weeks. He wasn't unfriendly, just intense. Always scribbling in his notebook, always asking questions about the town's history. Frank emerged from the kitchen with a slice of apple pie. "Recording again, Marcus? What's so interesting about our little corner of nowhere?" "You'd be surprised," Marcus said, clicking the record button. "Every place has stories. Sometimes the most interesting ones are the ones people don't realize they're telling." The noon hour brought another wave of customers. Local ranchers stopped by for lunch, their boots echoing on the black and white checkered floor. The mailman, Pete Rodriguez, grabbed his usual turkey sandwich. A young couple with out-of-state plates ordered burgers and asked for directions to the nearest gas station. Ellie moved between tables with practiced ease, taking orders, delivering food, making small talk. She'd grown up in Pine Ridge, but working at the diner had shown her sides of the town she'd never seen before. The way the construction workers fell silent when certain names were mentioned. The way some of the older residents' eyes would flick toward the mountains when they thought no one was looking. The way conversations sometimes stopped when Sheriff Hartman walked in. "Ellie, honey, can you cover the register for a minute?" Frank called from the kitchen around 1:30. "I need to check on the freezer. Been acting up all morning." Sure thing," Ellie said, finishing up with a table of tourists who were debating whether to visit the local museum or head straight to the hiking trails. Marcus was still in his booth, his recorder running, occasionally making notes in his worn leather notebook. He'd been there for over 2 hours, which wasn't unusual for him. He claimed he was capturing the authentic rhythms of small-town life, though Ellie sometimes wondered if he was just lonely. The afternoon stretched on with its usual lazy pace. The lunch rush ebbed, leaving mostly locals who treated the diner like their personal living room. Old-timers played checkers in the corner booth. A group of teenagers from her high school occupied the center table, their conversation a mix of summer plans and speculation about which teachers would be returning in the fall. Around 3 o'clock, Jenny Patterson pushed through the diner's front door, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Jenny had been Ellie's best friend since 3rd grade, and they'd made plans to drive up to Crystal Lake after Ellie's shift ended. It was one of their favorite spots, a hidden gem tucked into the mountains where they could talk without the whole town listening. "Hey, stranger," Jenny said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Ready for our lake adventure?" "Almost," Ellie replied, wiping down the coffee machine. "Just need to finish closing duties. Frank's been letting me handle more of the money stuff lately. Says I'm more responsible than his last 3 employees combined." "That's not saying much," Jenny laughed. "Remember when Kyle Morrison worked here and kept giving away free pie to impress girls?" They chatted while Ellie finished her tasks, their conversation flowing easily over topics that had occupied them all summer. College applications, boys, the eternal question of whether to stay in Pine Ridge or chase bigger dreams in bigger cities. Jenny had already been accepted to Colorado State University for linguistics. She'd always been fascinated by the way people communicated, the hidden meanings in everyday conversations. As 4 o'clock approached, the diner began its transition to evening mode. The afternoon regulars started filtering out, replaced by early dinner customers and travelers grabbing coffee for the road. Frank reappeared from the kitchen, his apron splattered with evidence of his ongoing battle with the temperamental freezer. "That old thing's on its last legs," he muttered, checking the cash register. "Ellie, you did good work today. Why don't you head out early? I can handle the dinner crowd." "You sure?" Ellie asked, already untying her apron. The prospect of extra time at the lake was tempting. The June evenings were perfect for swimming, and she'd been looking forward to it all week. "Go on." Frank waved her toward the door. "Just remember to lock up the supply room before you leave. I don't need any more surprises like last week." Ellie nodded, remembering the incident with the broken coffee filters that had left the morning shift scrambling. She grabbed her purse from behind the counter and headed toward the small storage room behind the kitchen. The supply room was cramped and poorly lit, filled with industrial-sized cans and boxes of diner supplies. She did a quick inventory check, a habit Frank had drilled into all his employees, and made sure the door was properly locked. As she walked back through the diner, she noticed Marcus was still in his booth, his recorder still running. He'd been there for nearly 4 hours now, which was unusual even for him. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that had become routine over the past few weeks. "See you tomorrow, Marcus," Ellie called out as she headed for the door. "Have a good evening, Ellie," he replied, his attention already back to his notebook. Jenny was waiting by her car, a faded blue Honda Civic that had seen better days, but still ran reliably. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the air carried the scent of pine and the distant promise of summer rain. Ready for our grand adventure? Jenny asked, jangling her keys. Absolutely, Ellie replied, climbing into the passenger seat. I've been looking forward to this all week. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Ellie caught a glimpse of Marcus through the diner window, still hunched over his notebook, his recorder capturing whatever conversations were happening around him. She wondered what he found so fascinating about their little town, what stories he thought he was uncovering in the everyday interactions of Pine Ridge residents. The Honda's engine hummed as they drove through the center of town, past the post office and the general store, past the elementary school where they'd both learned to read, past the churches and the small houses where families had lived for generations. Pine Ridge looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, predictable, safe. So, Jenny said, as they headed toward the mountain road that led to Crystal Lake, what's the deal with that journalist guy? Marcus something? Webb, Ellie supplied. Marcus Webb. I don't know. He seems harmless enough, just really focused on his work, whatever that is. Doesn't it strike you as weird that he's been here for a month and nobody really knows what he's writing about? Ellie considered this. Maybe. But you know how it is. People come through Pine Ridge all the time. Most of them are just passing through. But most of them don't spend 4 hours a day recording conversations in the diner. True, Ellie admitted. Though honestly, I don't think there's much exciting happening in our conversations that would interest anyone outside of Pine Ridge. As they drove higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped slightly, and the air grew thinner. Crystal Lake was about 20 minutes from town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of pine and aspen. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on tourist maps, known only to locals who'd grown up exploring these mountains. Did you hear about the Petersons' property? Jenny asked, navigating a particularly sharp turn. Apparently there's a development company interested in buying it. Really? That's been in their family for like 50 years. Economic times are tough, Jenny said. Dad says half the ranchers in the county are struggling to keep their land. They reached the lake just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Crystal Lake was small but perfectly formed, its surface reflecting the surrounding pine trees and the deep blue of the Colorado sky. A wooden dock extended into the water, weathered but sturdy, and a few picnic tables sat in the shade of the trees. This never gets old, Ellie said, breathing in the mountain air. They spread out an old blanket and sat by the water's edge, their conversation flowing easily between dreams and fears, plans and uncertainties. Jenny talked about her excitement for college, her major in linguistics, her fascination with the way people communicated. Ellie shared her own college plans. She'd been accepted to several schools, but was still weighing her options, trying to balance her desire to see the world with her sense of responsibility to her family. You know what I find interesting? Jenny said, skipping a stone across the lake's surface. The way people in Pine Ridge talk about certain things. Like there are subjects that everyone dances around, but nobody addresses directly, such as, well, like that whole thing with the Garrett family moving away so suddenly last year, or the way conversations stop when certain names come up, or the fact that nobody ever really talks about what happened at the old mining site. Ellie had noticed these things too, but she'd always attributed them to small-town politics and old grudges. Every community had its secrets, its unspoken tensions. Maybe that's just how small towns work, she said. People have long memories. Maybe. But sometimes I wonder if there's more to it than that. Dobil. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they packed up their things and headed back to town. The drive down the mountain was peaceful, the Honda's headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. They talked about their plans for the weekend, about the summer job Ellie was hoping to get at the community center, about Jenny's upcoming trip to visit her grandmother in Denver. Want to grab a milkshake before I drop you off? Jenny asked as they reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge. Actually, I should probably get home, Ellie said. Mom's working late again, and I want to make sure Dad's okay. Jenny nodded, understanding. The Monroe family's financial struggles weren't a secret in Pine Ridge, and everyone did what they could to help without making it obvious. It was one of the things Ellie loved about her hometown, the way people looked out for each other, the way problems became community problems. They drove through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, past houses where families were settling in for the evening, past the diner where a few cars still sat in the parking lot, past the sheriff's office where a single light burned in the window. The town felt exactly as it always had. Safe, familiar, predictable. "Same time tomorrow?" Jenny asked as she pulled into the Monroe's driveway. "Definitely," Ellie said. "Thanks for tonight. I needed that." "Me too. Sweet dreams, Elle." Ellie waved as Jenny drove away, then walked up the path to her house. The porch light was on, and she could see the blue glow of the television through the living room window. Her father was probably watching the news, as he did every night, keeping track of a world that seemed increasingly distant from their small corner of Colorado. Inside, the house was quiet except for the murmur of the TV. Her parents had already gone to bed. Her mother's early shift at the hospital required her to be up before dawn, and her father had taken to retiring early since losing his job. Ellie checked the locks on the doors, turned off the lights, and headed upstairs to her room. Her bedroom was a typical teenager's space: posters of bands and movies, a desk piled with college brochures, a bookshelf filled with novels and textbooks. She changed into her pajamas and sat at her desk, pulling out a notebook to write in the journal she'd been keeping sporadically since sophomore year. "June 14th, 2008, she wrote. "Another day at the diner. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to live somewhere else, somewhere where every day wasn't exactly like the last. But then I think about leaving Mom and Dad, especially with everything they're going through, and I can't imagine being anywhere else. Maybe some people are meant to be adventurers, and maybe some people are meant to be the ones who stay home and take care of things. I'm not sure which one I am yet." She closed the journal and got ready for bed, brushing her teeth and washing her face with the same routine she'd followed for years. Outside her window, Pine Ridge was settling into its nightly quiet, the kind of deep silence that only came to small mountain towns after dark. As she drifted off to sleep, Ellie had no way of knowing that 17 years later, a forgotten recording would surface, a reel of tape that had been sitting in a dusty evidence box, waiting for someone to press play. She couldn't know that her last ordinary day was ending, or that by tomorrow evening she would become the central figure in a mystery that would haunt Pine Ridge for decades to come. The last thing she remembered before sleep took her was the sound of a car engine idling somewhere in the distance, though she couldn't tell if it was real or just part of a dream that was already beginning to form in her subconscious mind. June 15th, 2008, arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to press against the windows of Pine Ridge like a held breath. The morning sky was overcast, heavy, with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms, the kind that rolled off the Continental Divide with little warning, turning dusty roads into muddy streams and sending tourists scrambling for cover. Ellie woke to the sound of her alarm clock at 5:30 a.m., earlier than usual. She'd volunteered to help Frank with the morning prep, since his regular cook had called in sick with food poisoning. The extra hours meant extra pay, and with her father's job interview approaching, every dollar mattered. The house was quiet as she dressed in her uniform, black pants, white shirt, and the green apron that marked her as a Sunrise Diner employee. Her parents were still sleeping, her mother having worked a double shift at the hospital, and her father having stayed up late filling out job applications online. Ellie left a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to work early. See you tonight. Love, E." The drive to the diner took her through the heart of Pine Ridge, past the elementary school, where maintenance crews were already preparing for summer renovations, past the post office where Pete Rodriguez was loading his truck for the morning mail route. The town looked different in the pre-dawn light, more isolated, more vulnerable somehow, as if the mountains were closing in. Frank was already at the diner when she arrived, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued by the early hour and the grey sky. "Morning, sunshine," he said, though his heart wasn't quite in it. "Thanks for coming in early. Between you and me, I'm getting too old for these 5 a.m. starts." "No problem," Ellie said, tying her apron. "What do you need me to do?" Coffee prep first, then we'll tackle the breakfast specials. Saturday mornings are always busy. Half the town comes in for pancakes and gossip. They worked in comfortable silence, following the familiar rhythm of restaurant preparation. Ellie ground coffee beans while Frank fired up the grill, the smell of bacon and brewing coffee gradually filling the diner. Outside, Pine Ridge was slowly waking up. Delivery trucks making their rounds, early joggers heading for the mountain trails, the first customers of the day pulling into the parking lot. Sheriff Hartman was among the first through the door, his usual punctuality undisturbed by the threatening weather. But something was different about him today. His typically relaxed demeanor was replaced by a subtle tension that Ellie couldn't quite identify. He took his usual seat at the counter, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows, as if he was watching for something. "Morning, Sheriff," Ellie said, pouring his coffee. "You're here earlier than usual." "Couldn't sleep," he replied, wrapping his weathered hands around the mug. "Sometimes this job follows you home, you know? Storms coming in, and that always makes people restless." The breakfast rush began around 7, bringing its usual mix of locals and weekend visitors. The Peterson family, ranchers who'd been struggling to keep their land, sat in the corner booth, their conversation hushed and serious. Mrs. Chen from the gift shop ordered her usual oatmeal and orange juice, but spent most of her time staring out the window at the darkening sky. Around 8:30, Marcus Webb made his entrance, carrying his leather satchel and wearing the same slightly rumpled clothes he'd had on the day before. He nodded to Ellie and took his usual booth. But something was different about him too. His usually steady hands were trembling slightly as he set up his recording equipment, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd had as little sleep as Sheriff Hartman. "The usual?" Ellie asked, though she already knew the answer. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice rougher than normal, "just coffee today, black, and keep it coming." He clicked on his recorder, but instead of his usual casual observation of the diner's atmosphere, he seemed to be listening for something specific. His eyes followed every conversation, every movement, with an intensity that made Ellie uncomfortable. The morning progressed, with its typical weekend pace, but there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone. Conversations were quieter, laughter was forced, and people kept glancing at the windows as if expecting something to happen. Even Frank, usually the picture of steady reliability, seemed on edge. "You notice anything weird about today?" Ellie asked, during a brief lull in customers. Frank looked up from the grill, his expression thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, yeah. People seem spooked about something. Could be the weather. Storms always make folks nervous around here." But Ellie didn't think it was just the weather. There was something else, something that felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Around 10 o'clock, Deputy Mike Collins pushed through the front door, his uniform crisp despite the humid air. Collins was young for a deputy, barely older than Ellie herself, and had only been with the sheriff's department for about a year. He was earnest and eager to please, the kind of officer who still believed he could make a real difference in the world. "Sheriff wants to see you when you get a chance," he said to Frank, his voice carrying an official tone that seemed out of place in the casual atmosphere of the diner. Frank's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "What about?" "Just routine questions. Nothing urgent." But the way Collins avoided eye contact suggested it was anything but routine. Frank wiped his hands on his apron and followed the deputy outside, leaving Ellie alone with the customers and her growing sense of unease. Through the window, she could see them talking by Collins' patrol car, their conversation animated despite the obvious attempt to keep it low-key. Frank's body language was defensive, his arms crossed, his head shaking in what looked like denial or disagreement. Collins was gesturing, pointing in the direction of the mountains, his expression serious. Marcus Webb was watching too, his recorder running, his notebook open to a fresh page. When he noticed Ellie looking at him, he gave her a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I guess," Ellie replied, though her attention was still on the conversation outside. Frank returned after about 10 minutes, his cheerful demeanor noticeably strained. He went straight to the kitchen without explanation, his movements sharp and agitated. The few customers in the diner had noticed the exchange, and the atmosphere grew even more tense. "Everything okay?" Ellie asked when she found a chance to speak to him privately. "Just some questions about the Wilson property," Frank said, not meeting her eyes. "You know how it is. Anytime something happens around here, they want to talk to everyone who might have seen something." Ellie knew about the Wilson property, a run-down ranch about 15 miles outside town that had been abandoned for years. She'd heard rumors that it was being used for drug activity, but she'd never paid much attention to local gossip. Now, though, the mention of it sent a chill through her. The lunch crowd was smaller than usual, as if word had somehow spread that this wasn't a normal Saturday at the Sunrise Diner. Marcus remained in his booth, his recorder running continuously, his consumption of coffee reaching levels that would have made most people jittery, but he seemed calm, almost unnaturally so, as if he was waiting for something to happen. Around 1 o'clock, Jenny Patterson arrived for her planned lunch with Ellie, but instead of her usual bright smile, Jenny looked troubled, her auburn hair damp from the humidity and her eyes darting around the diner, as if checking for threats. "We need to talk," she said quietly, sliding into the booth across from where Ellie was wiping down tables. "What's wrong?" "I was at the library this morning helping Mrs. Henderson with some filing," Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard her talking to someone on the phone, something about missing persons reports and state police involvement." Ellie felt her stomach tighten. "Missing persons? Who's missing?" "I couldn't hear everything, but it sounded like maybe someone from one of the neighboring towns. Mrs. Henderson looked really upset afterward." The afternoon wore on with a strange, expectant quality, as if the whole town was waiting for some kind of revelation. The threatened storm began to manifest in earnest around 3 o'clock, with distant rumbles of thunder and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the increasingly dark sky. Marcus Webb finally left his booth around 4, gathering his equipment with unusual haste. As he passed the counter, he stopped and looked at Ellie with an expression she couldn't read. "Be careful tonight," he said quietly. "Sometimes small towns aren't as safe as they seem." Before Ellie could ask what he meant, he was gone, pushing through the door into the gusty afternoon air. Through the window, she watched him climb into a dark sedan she'd never seen before, not the old pickup truck he'd been driving since arriving in Pine Ridge. "That was weird," she muttered, but Frank was in the kitchen and didn't hear her. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine tasks, made surreal by the growing tension. Customers came and went, but conversations were subdued, and everyone seemed to be listening for something that never came. The storm built steadily, turning the sky the color of old pewter and sending occasional gusts of wind, rattling the diner's windows. At 5 o'clock, Frank told Ellie she could leave early again. "Storm's going to hit soon," he said, glancing at the darkening sky. "You should get home before it gets bad." Ellie was grateful for the early dismissal, but as she untied her apron, she noticed Frank was also preparing to close, unusual for a Saturday evening. When she asked about it, he just shrugged and said business was slow. As she walked to her car, the first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering on the hot asphalt of the parking lot. The air was thick with humidity and the metallic smell that preceded major storms. She was fumbling with her keys when she heard it, the sound of a car engine idling somewhere nearby. She looked around the parking lot, but saw only her own car and Frank's pickup truck. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the highway, but the gathering darkness and the increasing wind made it impossible to see clearly. The drive home was treacherous, with visibility reduced by the heavy rain and occasional lightning strikes that illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary clarity. Pine Ridge looked different in the storm, older, more isolated, as if the mountains were reclaiming the small human settlement that had dared to exist in their shadows. At home, her parents were waiting with unusual anxiety. Her mother was pacing the living room, still in her hospital scrubs, while her father sat rigidly in his chair, the television news playing but ignored. "There you are," her mother said, relief evident in her voice. "We were getting worried about you driving in this weather." "I'm fine, Mom. Frank let me off early because of the storm." "That's good." her father said, though his attention seemed to be elsewhere. Sheriff Hartman called about an hour ago, wanted to know if we'd seen anything unusual lately. Ellie felt her stomach drop. What kind of unusual? Strangers around town, people asking questions, that sort of thing. He said they're just being cautious because of some trouble in the neighboring counties. The evening passed slowly, with all three family members trying to maintain normalcy while the storm raged outside. They ate dinner together, a rare occurrence given their conflicting schedules, and tried to watch television, but the weather kept interfering with the satellite signal. Around 9 o'clock, the phone rang. Janet answered, her voice becoming increasingly tense.
If you want to hear the rest of this story, please leave a comment on this video and subscribe.